What if your empire burned for centuries? Once, in the heart of Southeast Asia, rose a kingdom of warriors and merchants, monks and emperors, temples and fire. For 400 years, Ayutthaya ruled the rivers of Siam until the flames came. This is not just the story of a kingdom. It is the story of ambition, betrayal, and survival. Welcome to the rise and the burning of Ayutthaya. Before Ayutthaya rose in gold and fire, another kingdom ruled the rivers of Siam. Sukhothai, the first dawn of Thai civilization, was a place of peace, poetry, and faith. Its kings sponsored stone inscriptions and sacred texts. Its temples echoed with the early voices of Theravada monks. And its people believed they had found a balance between heaven and earth. But who were the people of this land? Long before Ayutthaya, the Chao Phraya Basin was home to a tapestry of cultures: Mon, Khmer, Thai, and Malay. The ancestors of the Thai were not native to these lowlands. They migrated south from the hills of southern China, centuries earlier, blending with local groups. By the 13th century, they spoke Thai languages, practiced Theravada Buddhism, and had begun to organize kingdoms. Ayutthaya was never a single tribe's empire. It was a mosaic, forged in rivers, trade, and movement. To understand its rise, we must understand this mixture, this fluid beginning. But dawn fades. By the early 14th century, Sukhothai's golden glow began to dim. Its kings grew weak, its tributaries turned restless, its borders frayed. And in the jungles of the Chao Phraya River Basin, Ayutthaya waited. History does not remember how softly the last bell of Sukhothai rang, but we remember what came next. In the year 1351, a man of vision took the throne. His name was Ramathibodi. He was not born into royalty, but he had the ambition of a dynasty. And more importantly, he understood the land. At the junction of the Chao Phraya, Lopburi, and Pasak rivers, Ramathibodi saw possibility. Here, protected by water, enriched by trade, and distant from the fading north, he founded Ayutthaya. He named it after Ayodhya, the mythical city of Rama in Hindu epics, a sign of divine purpose, a promise of greatness. Ayutthaya would not be a kingdom among kingdoms. It would be the center of a new world. From the beginning, Ayutthaya was more than walls and temples. It was a plan. Ramathibodi opened the ports to the world. Ships came from India, bearing spices and fabrics, from China, porcelain, tea, and officials hungry for silk. From Persia, weapons, perfumes, and wisdom. Markets swelled with goods and languages. Ayutthaya became a crossroads of culture, where gold, grain, and gods exchanged hands. But trade alone does not make an empire. So Ramathibodi crafted a system. Governors in the provinces, spies on the roads, taxes on every boat. Power flowed like the rivers themselves, steady, watchful, absolute. And soon, Ayutthaya was no longer a city. It was the heart of a machine. To rule men, one must rule their imaginations. Ramathibodi understood this. He declared himself a Devaraja, a divine king, not just chosen by heaven, but born from it. This idea did not come from Siam alone. It came from Angkor, from India, from centuries of belief that kings were gods made flesh. Temples were built in his image. Rituals crowned his name. Astrologers and priests surrounded his court, mapping the skies for signs of favor. But while Ramathibodi looked to the heavens, he kept his feet in the Dharma. He promoted Theravada Buddhism, a path of balance, humility, and merit. Monasteries multiplied. Monks walked in silence. Alms bowls filled the mornings. Ayutthaya's rulers were gods in gold, but they walked among orange robes. And that paradox of power and piety would define the empire for centuries. By the time Ramathibodi died in 1369, Ayutthaya was no longer a new city. It was the capital of a rising kingdom. His son took the throne. Enemies tested the borders. Temples rose higher. Laws grew longer. But the foundation had been laid. An empire was taking root, and history, in its slow, unforgiving rhythm, had begun to turn once again. Ayutthaya had arrived, not as a shadow of Sukhothai, but as its heir, its challenger, and one day, its conqueror. Ayutthaya had risen, but it was not alone. Across the jungles and mountains of Southeast Asia, other kingdoms held their ground. One of them was Angkor. The Khmer Empire had ruled for centuries, building temples that touched the sky and cities that defied time. Its heart was Angkor Thom, where gods once walked beside kings. But by the 15th century, cracks had formed. Internal unrest, environmental collapse, failing harvests, forgotten gods. What had once been a celestial kingdom was now an empire in retreat. And from the west, Ayutthaya came marching. It did not attack blindly. Its spies knew the gates. Its generals understood the terrain. Its ambitions were clear. In 1431, war elephants thundered at the gates of Angkor Thom. The Bayan watched in silence as flames rose into the sky. Ayutthaya sacked the city, looted its wealth, took its symbols, and broke its spell. They brought back statues, scripts, engineers, and artists. They didn't just conquer the city, they absorbed its soul. Angkor faded into the jungle. Ayutthaya inherited its shadow. But conquest brought new neighbors and new enemies. To the north, Lan Na, in the highlands of Chiang Mai. To the east, Lan Xang, the rising power of Laos. And in between, a patchwork of smaller realms, shifting loyalties, and silent border conflicts. Ayutthaya's ambitions clashed with mountain pride. These were not easy wars. The terrain was steep, the roads few, and the rivers swift. Elephants struggled in narrow passes. Cavalry fell from muddy cliffs. There were battles, brutal, muddy, and forgotten. There were treaties, signed in gold and broken in blood. And sometimes, there was only silence. A silent standoff between kings, each watching the other across fog-covered ridges, each knowing that one wrong move could mean war. The lines of power shifted yearly. Cities changed hands. Alliances dissolved like mist. Ayutthaya survived by adapting, by bribing one warlord and fighting the next, by marrying a daughter here and stationing soldiers there. No empire grows without resistance, and Ayutthaya, for all its power, was not invincible. Ayutthaya's armies were not just men. They were machines, built on discipline, rituals, and rhythm. At the center stood the war elephant, armored, trained, intelligent, terrifying. Each elephant carried not just soldiers, but symbols of kingship, of divine power, of inevitable victory. They were trained from birth. They learned to fear fire, to march to drums, to hold formation under arrows. They were holy beasts, blessed by monks, guided by spirits. Beside them marched infantry with spears and swords, archers, drummers, watchmen. The battlefield was a procession, half war, half ceremony. Signals were given with gongs and flags. Formations moved like theater. To the enemy, it was beautiful and horrifying. And behind it all, the war camps hummed. Blacksmiths forged blades. Generals mapped rivers. Messengers crossed jungles. Cooks fed thousands. Engineers built wooden bridges over crocodile-infested waters. Ayutthaya fought like a state, not a tribe. It did not rely on chaos. It built systems. It taxed land to fund armies. It conscripted villages. It rewarded loyalty with silver and land. When Ayutthaya marched, the earth remembered. But some stories are not written in maps or orders. They are carved into memory with blood. In the year 1548, Burma returned. Its army swept down upon Ayutthaya like a black tide. Towns were burned, fortresses breached, fear spread like fire. And as the battle raged, a queen stepped forward. Ayutthaya, dressed in armor, mounted her elephant, not to flee, but to fight. She rode beside her husband, the king. But when a Burmese prince charged his elephant straight at the royal platform, she moved first. She turned her beast into the path of the spear. It struck her heart. She died on the field, not as a consort, but as a warrior. No records written by Ayutthaya's enemies mention her, but her name lived on, whispered by monks, painted in murals, taught to every child. Her tomb was built in white stone. Her tale passed through generations. She was not Ayutthaya's greatest queen. She was its heart. Her sacrifice became a symbol of courage, of duty, of the silent strength behind the throne. And from that day forward, Ayutthaya knew even queens could bleed for the kingdom. Chapter 2 ends not with a victory, but with a warning. Power, once gained, must be held, and every kingdom, no matter how glorious, must learn to fight for its future. Ayutthaya, once a kingdom tucked deep in the jungles of Siam, now opened its gates to the world. Portuguese musketeers marched through its temples. Persian merchants arrived with silks and stories. Japanese ronin came seeking fortune. Chinese junks glided up the Chao Phraya, loaded with porcelain, spices, and gold. The city was no longer just the jewel of Southeast Asia. It had become a stage for the world. On riverbanks, deals were made in dozens of tongues. In markets, one could trade a barrel of salt for a cannon, or a tiger pelt for a manuscript from Mecca. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive, but soon came the Dutch, and with them, the VOC. Not just merchants, but an empire dressed as a company. The VOC built outposts, dug canals, and counted profits by the shipload. Their presence would shape Ayutthaya's fortunes and challenge its sovereignty. Ayutthaya, at its height, was a city of more than 1 million souls, bigger than London, richer than Paris. Foreign ambassadors wrote of its beauty with wonder and envy. There were canals instead of roads. Golden temples rose above wooden homes. And everywhere, sound of drums, of prayers, of bargaining, and of celebration. A walk through the capital could take you past a Japanese enclave with sword schools and samurai dojos, then into a Persian spice quarter where rosewater hung thick in the air, and end in a Portuguese artillery yard, echoing with the sound of cannon fire. This was not chaos, it was order, flowing like water through channels old and new. Maps of the city show something rare for the time: symmetry. Planned streets, rectangular islands, bridges in deliberate alignment. Thai engineers and monks shaped Ayutthaya not just to function, but to inspire. Temples were the crown jewels: Wat Phra Si Sanphet, Wat Chai Wathanaram, and more. They reached to the sky, covered in gold leaf, reflecting sunlight like beacons. Art thrived in this golden age. Traditional Khon masked dances were performed under starlight. Storytellers recited epics of Ramakien and local lore. Musicians blended drums, flutes, and string instruments from east and west. Literature flourished, not just courtly poems, but travelogues, satire, and Buddhist philosophy. Scribes used palm leaves and black lacquer ink to preserve the teachings and tales of their age. Buddhism remained central, a pillar amid the whirl of commerce. Monks served not just as religious guides, but also as teachers, judges, and sometimes even diplomats. Every neighborhood had its own monastery, a quiet place for reflection, surrounded by chaos. Foreigners often marveled at how monks seemed to float above the bustle, moving with calm purpose, unbothered by the noise and color of the world. And yet, beneath the gilded rooftops and orderly canals, Ayutthaya was also a kingdom of hierarchy and of struggle. The kingdom's social order was strict and stratified. At the top, the king, revered as semi-divine. Below him, the royal family, the nobles, and the military elite. Merchants and craftsmen held power too, especially those with ties to foreign trade. They built fortunes from spices, metals, elephants, and rice. But at the bottom of the pyramid were slaves, war captives, debtors, and those born into bondage. Their labor built the temples. Their hands rowed the royal barges. Their suffering paved the golden roads. Ayutthaya's grandeur had a cost, one rarely written in the Chronicles of Kings. But it was not all oppression. Some slaves could rise in rank, some were educated. Others found paths to freedom through the monkhood or the military. Still, the system was designed to hold order, not justice, and that order had deep roots. Even among nobles, status was not equal. Rank was measured in units called sakdina, literally field power, which determined everything from how many servants one could command to how closely one could stand near the king. It was a world where hierarchy governed behavior, dress, and even language. A commoner speaking to a noble used a different vocabulary, one of respect, distance, and duty. Foreigners found this bewildering, but within Ayutthaya, it was simply life. As the century progressed, foreign influence only grew. More Dutch ships arrived, followed by English merchants, French Jesuits, and Spanish missionaries. The capital became a diplomatic carnival. Each embassy came with gifts, clocks, maps, globes, rare books. In return, they received lacquerware, ivory, and royal favor. Ayutthaya managed it all with elegance. Never a colony, never a subject. Its kings knew how to balance power, playing foreign ambitions against one another like a master tactician moving chess pieces. Royal courts became multilingual hubs. Translators were in high demand. Interpreters mediated not just between words, but between worlds. Jesuit priests debated Buddhist monks. Persian astrologers consulted Thai kings. Chinese engineers worked on canal projects. It was a global city in every sense. And yet, this openness came with risk. Foreign enclaves brought not only trade, but rival loyalties. Weapons flowed in. So did new ideas. Questions of sovereignty, of God, of kingship, of revolution. They would not bloom yet, but the soil was fertile. Meanwhile, Ayutthaya continued to shine. Lanterns lit the night markets. Ceremonies filled the palace grounds. Elephants paraded down broad boulevards, their riders holding golden parasols. Children played by the riverbanks. Fishermen cast their nets in the early dawn. And the great bell of Wat Phra Ram rang out across the city, marking the rhythm of life. This was not just a capital. It was a world. A place where time seemed to flow in all directions, where ancient rituals met new horizons. This was Ayutthaya's golden age, not of peace, not of purity, but of power, creativity, and the rising tides of ambition. It would not last forever, but for 100 brilliant years, it changed the world and became a legend. King Narai ascended the throne in the year 1656, at a time when Ayutthaya was already a major player in Southeast Asia. But Narai wanted more. He did not see Siam as merely a kingdom to defend. He saw it as a kingdom to connect. A land not isolated in tradition, but interwoven with the threads of the wider world. He moved part of his court to Lopburi, building a second capital where science, strategy, and diplomacy could flourish. Lopburi became a place of wonder. Foreign envoys marveled at the architecture. Siamese scribes copied texts in Persian and Portuguese. a royal court filled with voices from across Asia and beyond. Narai spoke Persian fluently. He understood Portuguese. He welcomed traders from India, Persia, Japan, and Europe. He listened, he learned, he negotiated. But with openness came risk. Some saw him as a forward-thinking king. Others began to whisper that Narai was no longer a king of Siam, but a tool of foreign powers. Traditional courtiers grew uneasy. Buddhist monks questioned the presence of missionaries. Nobles felt ignored, sidelined. There was tension in the golden halls of Ayutthaya. Had the king opened the door too far? Across the world, in the glittering halls of Versailles, Louis XIV ruled as the Sun King. In Narai, he saw an opportunity, not only for trade, but for faith, for influence. And so the Jesuits came, not in secret, but in spectacle. They brought telescopes to chart the skies, clocks to mark the heavens, star maps and celestial globes, instruments of wonder and persuasion. Their observatories stood beside temples. Their sermons echoed near chanting monks. Some Siamese were intrigued, others alarmed. One missionary wrote back to Paris, "Siam is a fertile field. It waits only for the plow of Christ." But this was not a one-sided exchange. Narai sent envoys to France, one of the most spectacular missions left in 1685. Dressed in vibrant silk and bearing golden gifts, the Siamese ambassadors caused a sensation in Paris. In the Hall of Mirrors, they bowed before the Sun King. They presented ivory carvings, lacquerware, and letters written in golden script. Louis XIV was impressed. He ordered a return embassy. Jesuit mathematicians, French engineers, soldiers, priests, gifts of glass and knowledge. Ayutthaya, for a moment, felt like the center of the world. But behind the pageantry lay deeper motives. The French wanted trade. They wanted souls. They wanted influence at court. And one man gave them all three. His name was Constantine Phaulkon, a Greek who had arrived as a sailor and risen to become chief advisor to the king. Phaulkon was clever, fluent in multiple languages, adept at courtly intrigue, and completely committed to France. He built alliances with Jesuits. He negotiated French military posts in Siam. He oversaw trade contracts. He rose fast, too fast. The old nobility watched with growing hatred. To them, Phaulkon was not a bridge between East and West. He was a wedge. When King Narai fell ill in 1688, everything unraveled. General Phatracha, a loyalist to Siamese tradition, made his move. He stormed the palace. Phaulkon was arrested, interrogated, and tortured. The French troops stationed in Siam were suddenly unwelcome. Revolution brewed in Lopburi. Smoke from burning banners rose over the city walls. Jesuits hid in basements. Nobles took back their place at court. And in the end, Phaulkon was executed. His head placed on a pike as a warning to all who put foreign interests above Siam. The rebellion of 1688 was not just a palace coup. It was a national pivot. All French forces were expelled. Missionaries were forced to leave or go underground. Churches were shuttered. The port of Bangkok, once envisioned as a European gateway, was now sealed to Western warships. Ayutthaya, once open to the world, now turned inward. Trade continued, but carefully. Missionaries were monitored. No more embassies to Versailles. A silence fell over the observatories. Dust gathered on the glass lenses. Siam would not become a colony, but it paid a price. Suspicion, caution, isolation. Narai had tried to steer between cultures, but the kingdom chose one. Today, Narai's palace still stands in Lopburi, its walls echoing a time of cosmic dreams and diplomatic pageantry. Murals show foreign ships arriving. Letters in French, Persian, and Thai survive in archives. Students study the Jesuit star charts. Historians debate the turning point. Was Narai a visionary, ahead of his time? Or a man who trusted too easily? And what of Phaulkon, traitor, or scapegoat? Even now, the Narai era forces us to ask, How much outside influence is too much? What is the cost of isolation? And can a kingdom truly modernize without losing itself? Siam's gates would open again, in the 19th century, in the age of gunboats and empires. But that is another chapter. For now, the Narai era stands as both a triumph and a tragedy, a story of vision and its limits, a reminder that history is not made by kings alone, but by the choices of those who stand beside them, and the fears of those who watch from afar. After the reign of King Narai, Ayutthaya entered a period of deep uncertainty. The unity of the royal court fractured. No longer did the throne represent stability. Instead, it became a symbol of ambition, and ambition, left unchecked, became poison. Succession disputes erupted. One king succeeded another, sometimes peacefully, often violently. Royal brothers plotted against each other. Ministers whispered in corners. The halls of the palace, once a place of ceremony and learning, now echoed with doubt and distrust. In just 2 generations, Ayutthaya saw more kings than in the previous century. Some ruled for years, others for mere weeks. Assassinations, forced abdications, and coups became common. Outside the capital, the provinces suffered. Regional governors withheld taxes. Trade routes that once carried goods from Japan, Persia, and France now sat silent. The bustling marketplaces along the Chao Phraya grew quieter. Stalls closed. Boats stopped coming. Meanwhile, the temples still stood. Monks still chanted. But the kingdom's wealth faded. The people bore the burden of taxes. The bureaucracy grew corrupt. Merchants were squeezed for every coin. By 1740, Ayutthaya still looked grand, from a distance. But its walls were rotting. Its heart was tired. While Ayutthaya stumbled, another force was rising in the west. In Burma, a charismatic village chief named Alangpaya challenged the old Toungoo dynasty. He rallied peasants, monks, and disillusioned nobles. Within years, he seized power and declared a new era, the Konbaung dynasty. Where Ayutthaya hesitated, Konbaung acted. Its kings were warriors, expansionists. They built armies with muskets, cannons, and war elephants. They revived Burmese pride, and they looked outward, toward conquest. The Konbaung kings saw themselves not only as rulers of Burma, but as unifiers of all the lands between the Irrawaddy and the Mekong. They struck north into the Shan states, west into Arakan, and east into Siamese territory. For Ayutthaya, this was a gathering storm. The warnings were clear. Refugees arrived with tales of burning villages. Border outposts sent desperate letters, but the court debated and delayed. By 1750, the Konbaung war machine had grown unstoppable, and Ayutthaya, weakened and divided, had no answer. In 1765, the storm arrived. 2 massive Burmese armies invaded Siam. One advanced from the north, through Tak and Sukhothai. The other swept in from the west, cutting through the Tenasserim Mountains. Their target, Ayutthaya. The twin forces moved methodically, destroying fortresses, capturing towns. By early 1766, they encircled the capital. Ayutthaya, once a city of over 1 million, became a besieged island. For months, the city held. Cannons roared from the walls. Defenders patched breaches with bamboo and prayers. Monks carried water to the front lines. Women and children melted gold ornaments to pay soldiers. But supplies dwindled. Rice ran out. Wells grew foul. Disease crept through the alleys. Still, the king refused to surrender. He ordered temples to remain open. Public sermons spoke of karma and endurance. But behind closed doors, fear reigned. The Burmese built bridges over the rivers. They fired flaming arrows at night. They tunneled beneath the walls. And on April 7th, 1767, after 14 months of siege, the gates fell. The conquest was brutal. Burmese soldiers poured into the city, looting and torching everything in their path. The great temples, Wat Mahatha, Wat Ratchaburana, Wat Phra Sanphet, were stripped of gold. Statues of the Buddha were shattered. Monks who resisted were slaughtered. The royal palace was burned. The libraries that held centuries of Siamese chronicles were turned to ash. Thousands of homes collapsed in fire. The river choked with debris, blood, and smoke. Civilians fled, but found no refuge. The city was an inferno. Eyewitnesses described walls glowing red at night. Entire districts turned to rubble. The air unbreathable. The screams unending. Those who survived were taken as captives, marched north into Burma. Of the grand Ayutthaya that had once amazed foreign ambassadors, only ruins remained. The destruction of Ayutthaya was not only a military catastrophe, it was the death of an era. For 4 centuries, the city had been the beating heart of Siam, a place of diplomacy, trade, culture, and power. It had survived wars before, but not this one. There was no formal surrender, no last speech, no royal monument, only silence. But from the ashes, something stirred. A military leader named Taksin, who had escaped the siege, would soon rally survivors. He would rebuild in Thonburi. He would fight back. But that is another story. Ayutthaya's fall remains a turning point in Southeast Asian history, not just for its scale, but for what it meant. That even the most beautiful cities can be destroyed. That even the most powerful kingdoms can vanish. That history, like empires, is fragile. And yet, its memory endures. Through ruins, through stories, through questions that remain. What made Ayutthaya rise? What led to its fall? And what lessons still echo in the land where its temples once stood? The fall of Ayutthaya was not the end. In the ashes of the once great capital, survivors wandered. Temples smoldered, statues lay broken, and the Sacred Heart of Siam seemed to have vanished. But in the chaos, one man rose to lead, General Taksin. Born of Chinese descent, raised in Siamese tradition, loyal to the kingdom, but unbound by its past. He had escaped the siege. While many fell or fled, he made his way east to Chanthaburi, gathering men, supplies, and purpose. He saw not only loss, but opportunity. In 1768, he returned, sword in hand. Banner raised, he drove the Burmese out of the central plain and declared a new capital. Thonburi, across the river from the ruins. There were no marble palaces, no golden stupas, only determination and a vision of survival. Taksin crowned himself king, but more than a monarch, he was a unifier. He defeated regional warlords, reclaimed the north, pacified the south, and even launched campaigns into Cambodia. In less than a decade, he restored the territorial core of the fallen kingdom. Thonburi stood not as a rival to Ayutthaya, but as its heir, a place to hold the memory, and to begin again. Taksin's reign was brilliant and brief. Haunted by ambition and mysticism, he eventually lost the support of his court. In 1782, he was overthrown, but his legacy paved the way for something lasting. The Chakri dynasty. The new capital, founded that same year, was moved across the river to Bangkok, then known as Rattanakosin. Here, a new vision took shape, a capital infused with memory, yet unafraid to reinvent. The Grand Palace echoed Ayutthaya's symmetry. The Emerald Buddha, hidden during the chaos, was placed at the heart of the new royal temple. Wat Arun rose like a beacon over the river, Wat Pho became a center of knowledge, medicine, and arts. Scribes rewrote chronicles lost in the fire. Artisans rebuilt what had been shattered. Court rituals resumed. Royal robes, titles, and ceremonies were revived, with a Rattanakosin flair. Even the city layout preserved echoes of Ayutthaya, a spiritual continuity expressed in brick and stone. In music, in dance, in drama, the past was reimagined, not as a relic, but as a foundation. Ayutthaya's fall had been violent, its rebirth, cultural. Time passed, Bangkok grew, the Chakri kings modernized, Western powers arrived, Siam survived where others fell. And Ayutthaya, still in ruins, faded from relevance. But in the 20th century, something changed. Thailand, now a constitutional monarchy, began to look back. In the 1950s, archaeological teams began serious work on Ayutthaya. The temples were surveyed, catalogued, and protected. In 1991, the historic city of Ayutthaya was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Suddenly, the ruined bricks were not just old, they were sacred, national. School children were brought by the busload. Souvenir stalls appeared. Guided tours followed lines of ancient canals. But memory is never neutral. Thai school books spoke of Ayutthaya as a golden age, a unified kingdom, a victim of treachery and foreign aggression. The story of 1767 became more than history. It became myth. The image of the headless Buddha, the fire-lit skyline, the silent monks. Ayutthaya taught a lesson. Unity is strength. Division invites destruction. Governments used this memory. So did the monarchy. And so did the people, in ways no one predicted. Today, Ayutthaya lives again, not in stone, but in image. Historical dramas retell the lives of kings and queens. Novels place heroes in burning temples. Songs mourn the fall of the old city. Tourism thrives. Foreign visitors walk the same paths Jesuits and merchants once did. They photograph the stone Buddha wrapped in roots. They imagine a world that once was. But Ayutthaya also appears in unexpected places. Politicians invoke it in speeches. Let us not fall like Ayutthaya. Activists quote it. The city burned because the court was divided. TV hosts say it. TikToks echo it. In protest movements, the memory of Ayutthaya sometimes becomes a symbol of government failure, a warning to the present. In nationalism, it becomes a source of pride, proof that Thai civilization was great long before colonialism. In pop culture, it becomes aesthetic. Ancient brick, stylized gold, and royal tragedy. Ayutthaya has become a mirror. Each group sees something different, and in that reflection, it lives. Ayutthaya fell in 1767, but its story never ended. Its people survived, its culture evolved, its memory endured. We walk its ruins, not just as tourists, but as witnesses, as inheritors, as storytellers. We ask not only how it fell, but why it mattered. Its beauty, its complexity, its contradictions. Ayutthaya was not perfect. It had slaves. It had court intrigue. It made mistakes. But it was alive. A crossroads of Asia, a center of faith, trade, diplomacy, and art. And though its towers crumbled, its soul did not. Bangkok rose. The people rebuilt. The culture adapted. And in every dance, every temple bell, every child learning its history, Ayutthaya breathes again. The city is gone, but the flame never died. Its embers glow, in hearts, in stories, and in the future still to come. Time passed, empires fell, but something always remains, not the walls, not the crowns, but echoes, carved in rituals, whispered in language, guarded in stories. Ayutthaya lives on, not in its grandeur, but in the traces that survived. A posture in prayer, a rhythm in verse, a way of walking through the world. the scent of incense in the morning air, the way light bends through temple gates. Beneath the moss-covered ruins, beneath layers of dust and ash, the soul of a kingdom continues to breathe. Its breath is slow, ancient, yet not extinguished. For every ruin is a beginning, and every silence holds the memory of a voice. Each brick, each crack, each vine reaching skyward is a line in a poem without end, a fragment of eternity, resting patiently beneath our feet. Throughout history, great cities rose and fell. Ayutthaya stood like a lotus in the floodplain, rooted in mud, reaching for heaven. Rome, the eternal city, ruled continents from stone and steel. Its roads still stretch like veins across Europe. Angkor, a sacred mirror of heaven, hidden beneath jungle canopies. Stone faces watching centuries slip by with quiet grace. And Babylon, the city of gates, whispered its secrets into desert winds. Its name still conjures myths of power, beauty, and loss. Each built empires in their own image. Each left behind a trace, architecture, myth, memory. But time is a patient sculptor. It smooths ambition, it humbles pride, and even the strongest walls are softened by rain, by roots, by war. What unites them is not just their greatness, but the silence they leave behind. The quiet lesson carved in every fallen brick. Nothing endures unless it is remembered. And so, we remember, not to hold on, but to understand what it means to let go with reverence. Historians do not speak with one voice, but many. Each lens adds a new layer, each theory a new doorway. Some call Ayutthaya a lost kingdom of gold, a city of shimmering rooftops, of laws and lineages. Others speak of contradiction, a place of sacred rites and political cunning, where power wore a smile and trade masked conquest. It was a crossroads, not only of goods, but of faiths and philosophies, where monks debated Jesuits, where Chinese merchants bartered with Persian diplomats. One scholar writes, Ayutthaya was never just a Thai capital. It was a Southeast Asian experiment. Another, its fall marked not the end of an age, but the beginning of how nations remember. The past is not fixed. It shifts as we study it. And in that shifting, we learn, not about them, but about ourselves. We are the interpreters, the keepers of memory, and the questions we ask shape the answers we find. In Bangkok's museums, children gather around a miniature model of Ayutthaya. They point, they laugh, they ask questions. They search for their school, their home, their roots. In school books, the story is taught not as a tragedy, but as a foundation. It is no longer just what was lost, but what was passed on. In temples, in parades, in films and festivals, the kingdom lives again. Sometimes in the folds of a dancer's silk robe, sometimes in the lines of a drama, sometimes in the rhythm of a festival drum, sometimes in silence, where meaning needs no words. UNESCO gave it a title, but the people gave it meaning. In every mural, every shadow play, every moment of remembrance, Ayutthaya returns, not as ruins, but as identity. It is not a relic, it is a compass. We began with ashes, with shattered stone and silent halls, but we end not in loss, but in reflection. What is an empire when only ruins remain? Is it power, pride, legacy, or merely the illusion of permanence? Some say history is a story of winners, but what remains are the questions, whispered by those who came after. Is the empire the city or the story? Is it the gold or the grief? Is it the monument or the memory? We leave the answer to you. Because history is not a script, it is a dialogue, and the past does not truly fade as long as someone is still listening. Thank you for walking this path with us, from the rise of Ayutthaya to its enduring legacy. History is not a list of dates, it is a journey of meaning. If this journey moved you, share it, subscribe, join our growing community. Explore our spring store, where limited edition designs keep history alive in wearable form. Each piece tells a story of power, of loss, of continuity. Your support helps us preserve the tales that time might otherwise forget. And most of all, stay curious, because every ruin has a story, and every story deserves to be told.